Welcome to Monday's Mental Mistakes. This week we're looking at the survivorship bias. The survivorship bias is the tendency to focus on people or things that have survived some process when looking for explanations of their success. That is, when trying to explain why some things have survived this process, we tend to see the things that have survived as more important, while those things that didn't survive the process are either minimised or ignored. The survivorship bias makes us more likely to focus on successful people or successful companies as guides to our own success. And at the same time, we're actually unlikely to look at unsuccessful people or unsuccessful companies as being instructive. Here's a simple example. Consider an aspect of childhood that has changed appreciably in the last generation or two. Something that is done differently now compared to your own childhood or perhaps your parents' childhoods. Some good examples might be allowing children to play unsupervised on the street, mandatory seatbelt wearing in cars, the change in attitudes to bullying and how we tackle that, or parents being able to physically discipline their children. Now, in most societies, these things have changed over the last one or two generations. And when changes have been proposed, legislated, or normalised in society, there's often resistance. And one of the common objections is it was like that when we grew up and we turned out okay. That is, the speaker, often talking to their peers, argues that since they survived childhood intact, and presumably their peers have as well, despite not having these protections in place, that therefore these changes must be unnecessary. Now, the problem here is that those children who were hurt by not wearing seatbelts, by being allowed to play unsupervised on the street, by being bullied and not having that dealt with appropriately, or by being beaten by their parents, those children who did not survive that or were hurt by that are unlikely to be participating in the conversation in the first place. Of course, the speaker turned out okay. If they hadn't, they probably wouldn't be here to talk about it. That's survivorship bias. The principal way to counter survivorship bias is to ensure that you consider both survivors and non-survivors when looking for explanations. So, if you want to learn about what makes people successful, it is necessary to study both successful people and unsuccessful people. While many books will tell you the habits that are common to successful people, it's equally important to establish that these habits actually cause success. And to determine that, you need to make sure that these habits are also not common amongst unsuccessful people. A key question to ask yourself is this group of people or things a fair sample? Or are failures or dropouts excluded? For example, a university may tout itself by saying that 80% of its graduates get jobs. But if you're considering whether to attend this university, that statistic suffers from the survivorship bias, since it excludes all those students who did not graduate for one reason or another. One way that a university can improve their statistic of graduates getting jobs is by having unnecessarily restrictive graduation requirements, thereby preventing average students from graduating. While that might not be likely, it is actually important to look at a much more balanced sample of students. An important consideration is that we're always limited in what we can conclude from samples that only include survivors. So, consider a particular model of car. Suppose that we find that after, say, 10 years, all of the surviving cars of that particular model have pistons that are in good condition. Now, it might be tempting to reason, therefore, that the pistons in those cars were well made, since they've lasted 10 years. But on the other hand, we may equally reason that the pistons originally were actually inconsistently made, and that most of them may well have been poorly made, because many of the cars are no longer on the road, and that could well have been because of piston failure. Since pistons are essential to driving, it is no surprise that all of the surviving cars of that model have working pistons. And without examining the failures, we're limited in what we can deduce about the situation. In conclusion, the survivorship bias is the tendency to focus on people or things that have survived some process when we're looking for explanations of their success. Until next week, may all your mental mistakes be minor.